You have a better chance of being struck by lightning twice than being killed by a terrorist. You have a better chance of being shot by your own toddler. It's one of these things that the government has amped up as far as threat perception.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Going to Extremes with me, Dave Brundle. This series is a product of the United Nations Office of Counter Terrorism and has been created and produced by the International Hub on Behavioural Insights to Counter Terrorism, which is based in Doha, Qatar. This series is looking at a prototypical trajectory of radicalization. We're covering and examining 5 key areas: attraction, engagement, participation, disengagement, and reintegration. Our last episode focused on the attraction of joining a terrorist or extremist group, and today we're moving on to engagement. To guide us through this will be our own BI expert, Dr. Ken Reedy, and joining him to give us all the insights and the latest findings is Professor Mia Bloom. Mia has been working in terrorism research longer than most in her field, and recently she's been examining the conspiracy group QAnon and why it has risen in its number of followers and its increasingly public profile. Let's begin.
Mia, welcome on board.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. What I would like to do is take a deep dive on engagement. And what I'd like to focus on specifically is QAnon. I don't mean to wash over 30 years of your work because QAnon is a relatively new phenomenon, but it's gaining traction outside the United States and it's increasingly on people's radar. So let's get into it, Mia. What exactly is QAnon?
It's funny that you mention it because when Sofia Moskalenko and I first started working on this project about weaponized conspiracies and QAnon, we unpacked it, we examined the phenomenon, we looked at the number of attacks, and very quickly realized that it's not really a terrorist organization, much in the same way that the far right in the US wants to call Antifa a terrorist group. And it's more of sort of an idea that brings people together as an umbrella organization. In the underbelly of the internet on these discussion boards was that there was a global cabal of blood-drinking globalists controlling the world, and they were trafficking in children and they were raping children and drinking their blood. But it was interesting because as we looked at QAnon spreading globally, we noticed that it's actually not very popular in the Middle East.
Right, yeah.
And we looked for, like on Arabic channels and Telegram and Facebook, discussions of QAnon. Many of the countries in the Middle East have been, in some ways, maybe inoculated from QAnon. And so we've been looking at the spread of QAnon in places like not just North America, but Europe, Australia, even in Indonesia.
Oh, okay.
Which again, here you have a Muslim country, but not an Arab country. So this is a puzzle that we are still trying to figure out. A lot of this ideology resonated in part because people were at home, online, and more susceptible to conspiracy theories because of the pandemic starting in around March 2020.
I was going to ask, you already answered the question, but does it only pose a threat to the West? Because most of what I see is QAnon in North America, and it's with English-speaking people, and they're largely white, and they're largely Christian. But you mentioned Indonesia, and I'm wondering, are there any other countries where it's spreading to or finding resonance in?
We're seeing it spread through Latin America, which is surprising because there's an underlying racism in QAnon, which is very much a reflection of the right-wing ideology in the United States. It is most popular among white evangelicals. We see that QAnon has a lot of underlying conspiracies about people of color, about critical race theory. They're very anti-LGBTQ, especially the trans community. Nevertheless, it attracts people of color in Latin and South America. So that's been also curious. But there is definitely a threat, but it's not the threat that you would think. It's not a terrorist threat. When you look at the number of QAnon incidents, the vast majority are personal violence, like women who have lost custody of their children, kidnapping their own child, or parents perpetrating violence against their own children. But the danger that it does pose is it undermines democracy.
Yeah.
And it undermines trust and belief in elections, in the media, in government institutions, and in science.
When it comes to QAnon, a lot of the questions revolve around violence, terrorism. We don't know who will engage in violence. That's the million-dollar question. But we've got a pretty good idea of who will not. So even though QAnon has many followers, only some pose a violent threat. Could you walk us through the typologies of QAnon and the factors which facilitate violence? So you already mentioned mothers losing custody of their children. What about perhaps people who have a military background or a law enforcement background, or they're crossing over with the likes of the Oath Keepers or something like that? Who are the people we really should be focusing on, and those who we shouldn't be focusing on?
We have some data from the people who were arrested as a result of January 6th, 2021, the failed insurrection.
Yeah.
And I think that you've hit the nail on the head when you talked about this intersectionality. The Oath Keepers, or people who are in the military, who are veterans or active duty, or people who are 3%ers or even neo-Nazis. The potential for terrorism comes from that part of their personality, less so than the QAnon. And when you look at who were the most dangerous on January 6th versus who were the most visible, the QAnon people were particularly visible in part because they're walking around with giant Qs all over their clothing.
Yeah.
So part of what we looked at, Dr. Moskalenko and I, was who were really the most dangerous elements of January 6th, and then who was, for example, maybe bulking out the crowd.
Yeah.
This is where it's important to push back a little bit on the Soufan Center report that talked about QAnon as the next ISIS, because based on survey data that has been repeated multiple times, either by AEI, the American Enterprises Institute, which is a conservative think tank, or by the Institute for the Study of Religion, if it's 15% of the population that believes in the statement that there is a cabal of blood-drinking elites who are controlling the world, then that translates to around 30 million adults. And no terrorist group has ever had those kinds of numbers.
Yep.
So I'm actually very happy that Soufan was wrong, that it's not the next ISIS, because we don't want 30 million potential terrorists. But what we do want to focus in on is the mental health aspect that links QAnon and all of these other groups to belief in conspiracies, as well as the likelihood for self-harm.
Do we have data on that? Is there data on the mental health of? I know there is data on the January 6th people, but more generally, do we have information on that?
We have some, in part because Dr. Moskalenko has been running a number of surveys.
Yeah.
And so we are getting really interesting results. We're seeing differences within the QAnon population, but we're also seeing differences in what their loved ones think that they're capable of. So their loved ones think that they're capable of extreme violence, whereas people who self-identify as QAnon may not necessarily be as radicalized as some other random group who believe in the neo-Nazis or Patriot Front or some of the other things. But the difference also, let's say, using the Soufan comparison with ISIS, you couldn't be a little bit ISIS. You are either ISIS or you're not. You either believe in the jihadi ideology or you don't. Whereas with QAnon, you have degrees of QAnon-ness, like how much of this you believe. In part because QAnon created like an umbrella organization embracing all different kinds of conspiracies. And so you have brought together people who believe that the earth is flat, that there are lizard people on earth pretending to be human, that 9/11 was an inside job, that all of these conspiracies, that people who never spoke to each other are welcomed into the larger QAnon universe.
Do you know if there's any link between the lone actor research that's come out of University College London with Paul Gill and Noemi Buhana, and they looked at the mental health status of lone actors? Do you know if there's any? Is it a similar mental health range of conditions that you also see within QAnon, or is it different?
In fact, the Gill and Buana and also Corner research, because Paul has authored a number of these. what you noticed was there was a mental health angle, but the larger finding, I think, of that study was leakage.
Yeah.
Was that people who were about to perpetrate some mass casualty attack in 72 or 73% of the time had informed friends and family of some very important details of the plot.
Yeah.
And so I think that the bystander phenomenon with the lone actor research is really compelling.
Yeah.
Whereas with the QAnon data, we're seeing much higher degrees of mental illness. But we're also seeing one of the things that this QAnon phenomenon does is it actively tries to separate the individual from friends and family. So people are like shunning family that do this, but also that the family members involved are being encouraged to isolate. And so we may not have the same bystander effect because they're in these virtual echo chambers of like-minded individuals versus informing friends and family that they plan to do something imminently.
Yeah.
Like for example, at Uvalde, members of that family, or the shooting that occurred in Illinois, outside of Chicago, in a suburb, where the parents purchased the gun. So you have a lot of information from family members or friends of lone actor shooters that we don't necessarily have with QAnon. People will know when their family member is falling down the rabbit hole, but they might not know when they move from like radical ideas to starting to plan a radical act.
Nonetheless, though, there's loads of forum posting and all that goes with that when it comes to QAnon. But we also know from other research that, as you mentioned, the bystander problem, right? So people have leaked their plans. Again, I'm talking specifically here about lone actors. But then the problem is that onlookers don't do anything, and that's the bystander effect. And I'm just wondering, do we have any mechanisms in place for people who see a loved one or a friend going down that rabbit hole and then going further towards radical action, where they can say, okay, look, I need to call someone here, but maybe they're a bit reluctant to call the police, but they'd like to call at least help or advice. Is there any mechanism like that?
There have been mechanisms for people who suspect a family or friend is about to perpetrate some sort of violence.
Okay.
With QAnon, some of the off-ramps involve putting down the device and going for a walk or being out in nature. There are ways to interfere with the hold that QAnon conspiracy has over the individual. But what's really important to remember, and this is the million-dollar question that nobody has really tried to tackle, we conflate those postings of radical ideas with radicalization. Whereas the base rate of people who are posting anything radical, whether it's jihadi or QAnon or right-wing or even animal liberation on left-wing terrorism, that base rate of people who actually engage in real-world action is less than half of 1%. And so the problem is we're counting radical ideas, but it's a black box between radical ideas and radical action. And so it's actually, interestingly enough, one of the things that Dr. Moskalenko and I have been trying to resolve, like what happens in that black box that moves the person from their online radical persona to, buying a gun and shooting up a school or, taking their vehicle and ramming it into a crowd. And that's where we don't have enough research because people just focus on one side of it.
QAnon has a lot of female followers. I'm just wondering, what is it about QAnon that makes women so especially vulnerable to it?
It's one of the reasons why we call the book Pastels and Pedophiles Inside the Mind of QAnon. The pastels was to be the women, and we wanted to originally focus on women. One of the things that was so interesting, and I think it's been coming out in these January 6 hearings, was that women were very, very much involved in January 6th, as well as in QAnon, both in terms of disseminating that message, but also bringing the entire family in. And this is something from my own research on women in terrorism. If you get the women, you probably get the entire family. But I think the focus on children is particularly triggering for women. And then also the fact that in the summer of 2020, whoever was organizing sort of this QAnon campaign launched a hashtag campaign called Save the Children, which is the same name as the very well-known charity in the UK and US. But they stole the hashtag, and that really pulled women in, including left-wing women. And you started seeing QAnon content on Instagram, women's Instagram, like women who had previously posed like with yoga poses and posted their Buddhist ideology or something. All of a sudden now we're posting about QAnon. So I think it pulled a lot of women in. And between women initially promoting QAnon online, sometimes benefiting financially from it, like Tracy Beans, whose real name is Tracy Diaz, to politicians like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, who used QAnon to launch their political campaigns. Women are sort of the unsung silent heroes of this conspiracy.
It is oftentimes associated with the far right, but it is in fact also a left-wing thing as well. And I've personal experience of this. I like to watch the cooking channels, and I cook with my kids. I was on a channel last year, and there was a young lady teaching me how to make cupcakes. I was making them with the kids. And then suddenly it went into this Save the Children, little speech. I was very surprised. And that's when I learned that, in fact, QAnon is far bigger than I thought it was.
It's bigger. And when they did these surveys at AEI, they asked people about their political associations. And 7% of the people who agreed with the statement that there was a blood drinking cabal controlling the world identified as Democrats. So, but as far as the QAnon is concerned, there were around 5,000 of these Q drops, which were how QAnon conveyed their cryptic messages. If you post 5,000 things, one is eventually going to be correct. And that's kind of all they need. It reminds me of Maggie Thatcher talking about the IRA, saying that we have to be right every single time to prevent terrorism, and they only have to get it right once. And so, for example, on the QAnon channels, they had posted that Bill Gates was associated with Jeffrey Epstein. And so when Melinda and Bill announced that they were divorcing and it was connected to Jeffrey Epstein, they got their win. You see, we were right. So now you can ignore the 4,999 things that were wrong and focus on the one thing that we knew and we were right.
Well, tell me then, should we be dialing up the threat posed by QAnon or maybe dialing it down? What do you think?
As far as the U.S. government is concerned, I think the focus on improving access to mental health services would be the way to go. But we also, like with terrorism, and, again, this has been my bread and butter. I have every incentive to exaggerate the threat. But we also know what the data looks like. And quoting John Mueller's work, you have a better chance of being struck by lightning twice than being killed by a terrorist. You have a better chance of being shot by your own toddler than being killed by a terrorist. And so, again, it's one of these things that the government has amped up as far as threat perception. And there's been a lot of money thrown at the problem. People are and when I say arousal, I mean the psychological sense and not in the sexual sense. But people are so incredibly aroused by the threat of terrorism that there are all these incentives to exaggerate a threat, which was actually a very small threat. It was never existential threat to the United States. It's different in other places. If you're a soldier in Afghanistan or Iraq, then your chances were probably higher of being killed by a terrorist. But for the average person, they were throwing money in Wichita, Kansas for counterterrorism. And I'm like, I don't think you need to worry, Kansas.
You mentioned there was an applied chapter in the book you wrote with Dr. Moskalenko. Could you give us a quick overview, just for the listeners who may have family and friends who are going down a conspiracy rabbit hole?
So I want to give fair credit to Sophia, since she is a social and clinical psychologist. She talks in the book about unfrozen social domains. And so for the non-psychologist like me, what does that mean? A lot of people have very strongly held beliefs. And when those beliefs are challenged, they become more vulnerable to radicalization. So an example would be with gender. If you're of a certain age, you were brought up believing that there were boys and girls. There was basically only the two. And I think that now that we have not just trans, but you also have people who don't identify, who are not binary, who are androgynous, who are asexual, like there's lots of all these other categories. That can be very discombobulating for people who were brought up with this notion that the only true scientific fact was that there were biological differences between men and women, and that was it. And I think that once those start being challenged, people now become confused and maybe more receptive to conspiracy theories and other kinds of disinformation. And I think it's that black and white thinking that makes people susceptible to radicalization, which you see, for example, why there were so many jihadis who were engineers. Engineering in the hard sciences attracts a personality type that likes a right answer and not an answer that could be shades of gray. So, if you're a social scientist or if you're liberal arts, you know that there's lots of different interpretations and viewpoints.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're a mathematician, there is only one answer. And so it's one of the reasons why we see a disproportionate number of people in the hard sciences were attracted to jihadi ideology. It might have attracted a kind of individual on the spectrum of autism that there has to be one answer. And providing that one answer for people who don't like shades of gray is very satisfying, in the same way that conspiracy theories provide people some sort of succor in a world full of questions. And we were facing multiple pandemics. We were facing a social justice pandemic, a health pandemic, a financial crisis. Like there were so many things going on that would cause people anxiety. Having a right answer or having the answer that you thought you figured out yourself provided some sort of solace. And we think that that's one of the reasons why QAnon was so attractive.
Yeah. Yeah, there is, I think, certainly something very comforting when you believe in a conspiracy theory. The world makes a lot of sense. We usually end with some quick fire questions. And so it's just sort of yes or no, or maybe you have a few
I'll be brief.
Points. So question number one, can we profile terrorists?
It's a fantastic question. And I remember in 2009, I was asked to do that. And I said, oh, gentlemen, you wasted your money because there is no profile. And I said, but wait, there are some behavioral profiles. Mm-hmm. And so there are behavioral elements. So we don't profile them based on ethnicity or how they look or what religion they practice, but there's certain behaviors that you can look for that are a little bit predictive of moving from radical ideas to radical actions.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think that anyone can get radicalized?
I think that a lot of people who are radicalized into terrorism are very normal people who felt that there was no choice. Terrorist groups don't want people with mental illness. People with mental illness are not reliable. They're more prone to leakage. They're more prone to failure. Maybe one segment of the IRA in Ireland wanted people who were sociopaths, like the nutting squads. But for the most part, you want normal, well-adjusted individuals. But the radicalization doesn't have to lead to negative, violent outcomes. You can be radicalized and use that energy for pro-social things. So people, for example, they marched, they gave money to charities, they did more good deeds. They were radicalized, but they weren't radicalized to become suicide bombers. But in the course of, a 30 plus, we don't want to talk about my age, but 30 plus career of interviewing terrorists, that many of them are charming and intelligent and nice, and they're not all crazies. So I think that anyone can be radicalized depending on what the issue is, but not all of those people who are radicalized are going to turn into violent extremists.
Are there any PVE or reintegration initiatives you think we should see more of?
One of the challenges has been that a lot of the CVE, PVE initiatives don't, one, include women. Like they don't generally understand that what necessarily incentivizes men incentivizes women. So there might be different pathways into radicalization. I think the lack of aftercare with most of these programs is a problem because we've seen graduates of CVE, PVE programs, for example, the London Bridge attack. Like he literally came from a CVE event. CVE is problematic because changing hearts and minds is far more difficult than changing actions. Because, for example, a lot of these former jihadis, former neo-Nazis, who have become like these celebrity ex-terrorists, in many ways, they are still radical, but they're not killing people. So, and they may still have the same views, like they may still hate Jewish people or gay people or other groups, but they've channeled their anger or they've channeled their ideology into something else. So I think the aftercare is part of it, but also the focus. We may have to focus on, okay, so you're angry. I understand. I get that. I'm also angry, but here's what you can do that isn't about killing people. And then having a lot of aftercare.
Related to what you said, are there any myths about radicalization you'd like to dispel?
Well, the biggest myth is that you're going to be able to change someone's hearts and minds. And I think that sets the bar so high, and you're almost guaranteed to failure. The other thing that maybe triggers me, that there are root causes. So this root causes argument is sort of one of these straw man arguments, because the root causes exist for everyone. And I'll give you the best example. Looking at Palestinians involved in, let's say, terrorist movements, you have two brothers. You have the Shikaki brothers. Mm-hmm. So one brother gets a PhD at Columbia University, Khalil, and he basically has a peace organization. And his brother, Fatih, founded the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Now, they were 2 years apart, same house, same family, same Israeli occupation, same everything. So both the nature and the nurture would have been exactly the same. Mm-hmm. And so I think the problem with root causes is it takes away the individual agency to make the decision, no, I'm not going to kill people. Yes, I am going to kill people. I remembered when I did my field research, in the same family in Belfast, one child became a priest and one child joined the IRA. So you have lots of examples like this. And I think that this idea that there's root causes implies that there's root solutions, and there aren't. Yeah. There are no easy fixes.
What's the main takeaway you want practitioners and policymakers to know?
I think the main takeaway would be, it was a very complex phenomenon in which an individual became involved with a group. It wasn't an overnight. And so there is no easy answer or easy fix. Anything that you come up with has to be at least as complicated as the process in to provide the process out. And that it's not a short-term process. It's a long-term process that involves multi-pronged approaches.
Mia Bloom, thank you for your time. We'll leave it there. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me and allow me to pontificate.
It was great fun. Thank you so much.
Going to Extremes is produced in Doha, Qatar, by the International Hub for Behavioural Insights to Counter Terrorism. This series is a product of the United Nations Office of Counter Terrorism. The information and opinions presented in this podcast by the guest speakers are those of the speakers. They do not purport to reflect the opinion or views of the UNOCT, the United Nations, or any of its affiliated organizations. For more information, visit our website, un.org/counterterrorism. You can follow us on Twitter using the handle @UN_OCT and join the conversation using the hashtag #GoingToExtremes.